Every year in America,
I mean, it just breaks my heart.
more than 16,000 dogs and cats undergo painful experiments in the name of medical progress.
We don't want our tax dollars being spent to torture pets.
This week on Open Record,
I don't think we should do research on dogs or cats.
a seismic shift
I think it's unconscionable.
from the #1 source of public funds for animal research,
I do believe that this is a tipping point.
and the undercover investigation that shows what they're trying to stop. From the FOX6 studios, this is Open Record. I'm Bryan Polcyn. Sarah Smith is away this week, but I'm joined by a couple of Open Records regulars here. We have Contact 6's Jenna Sachs. Hello, Jenna.
Hey.
And we have FOX 6's Carl Defenbaugh. Hello, Carl.
Thanks for having me back.
Welcome back to Open Record. We are recording this episode on Wednesday, July 30th, and as we record, we are still waiting to hear from the special prosecutor investigating possible criminal charges against Ridgeland Farms, a commercial dog breeder west of Madison. Sources tell me something could be coming soon, perhaps even yet this week. Not certain, but it's the kind of thing a lot of people are waiting for. In the world of animal research, though, a lot is already happening. Bold new comments recently from the National Institutes of Health, new legislation aimed at protecting dogs and cats from painful experiments, and a newly released undercover investigation by PETA involving dogs from Ridgeland Farms here in Wisconsin at a troubled lab in Colorado. We'll talk about all of that and more when we come back after this break. We are back on Open Record. I just want to say one thing, by the way. You notice my voice is really scratchy right
that's
now?
a little.
We got a lot of talking to do, so I hope it holds up throughout this whole time. But if you stick around for our Off the Record segment, you're going to find out why I sound this way.
Ooh, okay.
It's not just, a simple cold. There's something more to it, and I'm to blame. But that's something just plug for later on.
Tease in the
that is
business.
a tease. Yeah, stick around for Off the Record.
So you've been talking about Ridgeland Farms for a few months now. Can you give us a little background for those who maybe haven't listened to our prior podcasts on this topic or haven't seen any of your reports on Fox 6?
Yeah, we've reported on it a lot, but if you're new to this or if you just want to be caught up to speed, Ridgeland Farms is located about 30 miles west of Madison in Blue Mounds, Wisconsin. They breed beagle puppies for scientific experiments. It's been there since the 1960s. This place has been around a long time. In 2017, activists actually went inside illegally. They got video and they rescued, well, I say illegally. They say it wasn't. They say they were performing a legal rescue. Nonetheless, they went in without permission. They got these 3 dogs. They pulled them out. And that was, obviously 8 years ago, but it was only just this last fall when there was, during a criminal investigation that, or a criminal actually prosecution, that the DA dropped the charges against those activists. And that was at the behest of Ridgeland Farms, who said, let's just drop the whole thing. And they wanted it to kind of go away. But those activists turned the tables. They went back to court and said, we actually want Ridgeland Farms charged with crimes, and they petitioned for a special prosecutor to be brought in to consider criminal charges. The Dane County DA would not charge Ridgeland Farms with animal cruelty. They said, we think we have evidence that there should be such charges. That happened in the fall, and in January, a special prosecutor was in fact appointed, and that is an ongoing investigation as to whether or not La Crosse County DA Tim Grinke will bring those charges. But what they found, what we heard in that testimony, was that the head veterinarian, a man named Rich Van Dommelen, had been delegating medical procedures to others who have no veterinary training to do procedures like snipping cherry eye. They call them cherry eyes, or swollen glands that beagles often get, and cutting these things with no anesthesia. Very bloody procedures, no medical training or veterinary training other than just sort of on-the-job training. And that led to a call for Rich Van Dommelen's license to be suspended. Instead of immediately suspending his license, the state said, we'll let him keep his license with certain agreements going forward. No more delegating these procedures while this investigation continues. And that's kind of where we are now. There's a lot of activists who want to see Ridgeland Farms shut down. They don't like the idea of dogs being bred purely for experimentation. It's legal, a legal business. It's a perfectly legal thing to do. The question is, how are the dogs being treated there? Are there things there that are cruel and beyond what the law allows, that still sort of remains to be seen. But that's how we got into looking at all this.
Some
in
of
the
this is
first
catching
place.
people up if they haven't been familiar with it. But my first question going in, and I know you've answered this in some of the stories, is why dogs and why beagles specifically? They're such adorable animals to begin with.
Well,
but
and
there's a specific reason that Ridgeland focuses on beagles.
Yeah, and it's a good question. It's something we talked about in our very first story, something that I discovered I wasn't even aware of, is that if you go back to the 1950s and 60s, it was actually the federal government, the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission at the time, was doing nuclear experiments and testing radiation. And they found that beagles were the perfect experimental animal because they're similar to humans in their makeup, more similar than mice and some of the other things you often hear about in animal testing, but also their temperament. They're docile. They essentially
fight.
They don't bite. They don't fight back. They put up with a lot of, tough stuff without really making things difficult on the researchers. So they became, for not just the government, but for a lot of private industry, a really sought after research animal. And beagles have been bred for generations now, not just at Ridgeland Farms in Wisconsin, but at other places, as purely research animals. I mean, they're born and bred, raised and sold for the express purpose of being used in lab experiments.
Before we dive into this national push to eliminate animal testing, can we talk a bit about why Ridgeland Farms and other places like it exist in the first place? They're supposed to be advancing medical research, right?
I mean, the idea behind whether it's beagle puppies, whether it's rabbits or pigs or other things, the idea behind animal research, and it's been required by the FDA for many, many years, is that if you want to get a product that will help, maybe it's a drug for human use to make humans' lives better, that before you can start testing things on humans, you need to show that they work in animals. Animals, I guess seen as less risky or troublesome or ethically problematic than just testing stuff on humans, because who are you going to subject to something that could be fatal or that might not work? So you start in animals. Once you prove it works, say in mice, maybe you then have to show that it works in a dog. And then after that, you might show that, that we're ready for clinical trials in humans. And it's been that way for a really long time. But there are changes happening. There are moves and pushes to get away from animal testing and to do things that were newer technology. It could be more relevant to humans.
There's this odd and kind of ugly in some way ethical spectrum, right? Like maybe people react differently when they see a beagle, when they see a mouse or a lab rat, right? Is the term that we use in many cases like this. Specifically this case into Ridgeland, they've been very shrouded in mystery, right? You have reached out repeatedly. You haven't heard much from them, haven't been allowed inside. So much of your story relies on video from those first people who kind of broke in or went in, and then the testimony from some of those prosecutions as well. And it's the combination of visuals and people who worked at the farm, I think, that have caught so many people's attention with this series of stories that you've done, because of just how brutal it is to see the situation and to hear some of the things happening.
Well, that's great foreshadowing, because we do have a guest who's going to join us in just a little bit, whose organization is well known for things that may have nothing to do with animal experiments, but PETA is known for, obviously very colorful and attention-grabbing demonstrations and things to call attention to the consumption of animals, but they do a lot of focusing on experimentation. And one of the things that we'll talk about with our guest, but I've talked about with these other organizations, is sometimes they're willing to go lengths that others might not be. They are willing to maybe even, and I'm not saying PETA's done this, but some of the organizations in this case broke laws because they said the only way to show you what's going on in these places that are otherwise shrouded in secrecy is to get inside and get the video. It is often the video that really grabs people. Yeah. And I think ever since we started doing these stories, every time you see those dogs just in endless cages, barking, dying for human attention, craving some sort of attention, you go, that's where they live 24 hours. That is what tugs at the heartstrings. And I think what gets people attention to, okay, so what are we really doing with these animals and why? And that's what's led to a lot of this.
You mentioned this group called White Coat Waste in your stories. It's a group that's been exposing some of these painful experiences on animals, including the ones at Ridgeland Farms. And we know they're pressuring federal agencies to stop supporting testing on dogs and cats and I guess animals that are more pet-like than, rats and mice like Carl mentioned. Are there any changes being made? Are any of those pushes getting results?
Well, certainly the White Coat Waste Project has been one of the most influential and I think aggressive groups in going after funding, particularly public funding
Follow the money,
of
right?
animal experiment. And that's what they're saying is if the money isn't there, then you got to find another way. So they've been going after that. And you think right now is an interesting time because you have all of the talk about things like DOGE and cost cutting and the Trump administration wanting to reduce funding for science. They see this as an opportunity to say, if we can get people on board with anything, it's why would we put dogs and cats through painful experiments? Let's cut funding for that. Now, it's not clear how much money goes specifically to dog and cat experiments. White Coat Waste has said it's about $20 billion a year on all kinds of animal testing. So why are they focusing on dogs and cats? And it's just what you said, Carl, and what you were alluding to. Because we can look at dogs and cats and see them in our own homes and go, okay, well, I don't think we should be testing on beagles. Mice, maybe it doesn't bother me so much. But then you get into the nitty gritty of it and go, well, what's the difference? And I do think that's where that slippery slope of the ethical discussion comes in. But I think they see an opportunity. Most people can rally behind the idea of not testing dogs and cats. So they have been pushing Congress and pushing the National Institutes of Health to stop this funding. NIH has just recently started saying, we agree. We don't think we should be doing animal experiments, and especially dog and cat testing. It was just a couple of weeks ago, in fact, that the director of NIH, he has a podcast like we do.
Everyone has a
It's
podcast.
an official
Everybody
government
does
podcast.
these days.
Dr. Jay Bhattacharya has got from the director's desk, and he's sitting there and he has a deputy director, there's many deputy directors, but a deputy director with a long title who's in there, and she focuses a lot on this kind of programming. And he asked her, what do you think we should do about this? And she said, you want my honest opinion? Yeah. She says, I don't think we should be testing dogs and cats. I think it's unconscionable. And that's a pretty strong statement from an agency that has long publicly funded with millions of dollars these kinds of experiments. So they're saying what a lot of animal activists want to hear, but White Coat Waste hasn't yet been satisfied with that. They've actually said, it's one thing to say it, it's another thing to do it. And they're still extending existing grants, including one we've talked about at the University of Missouri, where they're infesting beagle puppies with ticks that are diseased so they can give these dogs Rocky Mountain spotted fever and then see if a vaccine works or how much of a vaccine their bodies can handle. And some of them are going to get too much and they won't be able to handle it. So those are painful experiments and they're still paying for them. And that's where some of the controversy remains.
This is not the easiest question, but I think it's a fair one too. What is lost if this testing does not happen with animals?
And that's
ultimately the goal of many of these studies is to advance medical science and provide drugs to humans that can save lives, human lives in
That's
this case.
absolutely the fundamental question here is what is lost. Now, you would hear one side tell you, and those who oppose animal testing would say, animal testing is already unreliable. 90% of the time something is successful in animals, it doesn't translate to a human biologic or treatment later on because those things tend to be, they tend to fail when you get to human trials.
98? Is that
90%?
That's still a huge number.
It's
It's
a
not what
huge
I
number.
would
So there's
imagine.
a lot of money invested, a lot of time invested in things that ultimately fail. There are new technologies that some would say are going to be more reliable, but they're still in the stage of being validated. And that's one of the things is for the federal government to validate these as better alternatives, they've got to put money and time and resources into that. And some of the debate is if you're still putting it into the old-fashioned animal testing, are we going to get these up to speed? Depending on who you talk to, some will say it's already ready. Others will say it's a long way off. There is a sea change happening. The question is, how long is that change going to take? But you're right. If you want to develop drugs that are good for humans, then you've got to test them somewhere.
Can I ask a question about that number? Again, 90%.
Seems really high.
Clearly jumps out to Jenna and me. If something is basically failing 90% of the time, you probably wouldn't keep doing it. So why has
so
it?
that's a good question, and maybe I'm not even the best person to ask, but I'll tell you what I've been told and what people have said to me, and that is, number one, just because it doesn't develop a specific drug doesn't mean you haven't learned something from the research that can be built on by others. So a lot of basic research, a lot of original research is built on, somebody else did this, and then we take it this way, and eventually maybe it leads to something. But you can't draw the direct line and say this research was, because it worked in a mouse, immediately made a successful drug in a human. 90% of the time, it doesn't get there. That doesn't mean there are 100% failures. There's still things that may be learned by that. And the other reason is, until now, there really hasn't been any other way. You can't test something just starting out in humans. So you've got to start somewhere. The question is, are animal models reliable enough or are unreliable enough to be replaced by these new technologies, which we're still learning more about, which need to be validated. But our computational models, AI models, organoids, organ chips, are they ultimately going to be better? Are they going to be cheaper? Are they going to be more reliable than animal testing? Certainly the advocates for those things will say they are.
So are members of Congress taking interest in this issue? Because it sounds like some wrote a letter to the NIH and others have proposed legislation.
Right after NIH came out and said this, actually, I think it was just 2 days before. 2 days before NIH made these comments in the podcast, 11 members of Congress, all Republicans, wrote to the NIH director, who was a Trump appointee. So this is Republicans going after a Republican appointed NIH director. But they said, we want you to stop doing this. This is, they call them barbaric dog and cat experiments. They said, stop immediately. And instead of waiting, you now have a Congresswoman, Nancy Mace from South Carolina, who's come out and introduced legislation that would prohibit NIH from supporting financially any kind of specifically painful dog and cat experiments. And to define painful, USDA has these categories we've talked about in our stories of pain. If you can do research where animals are involved in testing, but there's no discomfort whatsoever. I think there are categories A, B, and C where there's really no pain or discomfort. Category D, there is pain or discomfort, but it's treated. They're given an analgesic or pain relief or some kind. Category E is the most controversial. That is where you are inducing some sort of pain or distress on an animal and intentionally withholding treatment, which is necessary if you're looking, for instance, at a control group. We want to see how these dogs respond with the vaccine, but we need to see what happens to these dogs who don't get the vaccine. They just get the Rocky Mountain spotted fever. Well, that can lead to a category E, which is really the kind of the highest level. White Coat Waste calls it maximum pain experiments. This legislation would say you can't do that anymore, at least not with dogs and cats.
Is this something that has received interest across the political spectrum as well? You say it's all Republicans in this case, but is it something that both sides
That's
of the
what's been
aisle
interesting.
seem to be?
White Coat Waste is actually founded by someone who's a Republican activist or Republican operative. And you've got these Republicans writing because they want to cut the funding. But on the other side, you've got long running animal rights groups that tend to be more on the left side of things. And a lot of vegans have been reaching out to me since we've done these stories going, we love that you're doing this. Small percentage of the population is actually vegan, but many vegans are animal activists.
Sure.
And so you've got this really interesting coalition.
Yeah, you wouldn't expect them to be on the same team.
It seems like
necessarily
unlikely allies, but in this case, they've been allies. And I think, again, in the realm of dogs and cats, it seems like there's a lot of, our response to these stories has been overwhelmingly one-sided. But if you started going toward, well, should we be testing mice or should we be eating chickens? All of a sudden you would see a very different response.
Right.
I think right now it's easy to look at dogs and cats and most people go, yeah, I don't think we should be putting them through experiments. I don't want to hold off on our guest any longer though, because he's going to probably have some thoughts on this. Tens of thousands of dogs and cats for now are still the subject of these category D and E experiments, like 16,000 a year, according to USDA figures. And one organization's going undercover to expose some of these experiments. That includes a Ridgeland Farms beagle sold to a troubled lab in Colorado. We're going to talk about what they caught on camera when we come right back. Welcome back to Open Record. We are joined now by Dan Payton. He is the Vice President of Investigations for PETA. Dan, thank you for being here on Open Record.
Thanks for having me. My pleasure.
So, PETA is probably best known for these attention-grabbing, sometimes controversial demonstrations and opposition to animals, for instance, as human food. But one area I know you do a lot of work is on exposing animal experimentation. About a week ago, you posted video of a beagle named Temple, rescued from a Colorado research lab where an undercover investigator worked for, I think you said 6 months. And it turns out Temple was actually born here in Wisconsin at Ridgeland Farms. Tell us a little bit about Temple's journey and how you came to rescue this beagle.
Sure. So yeah, Temple, as you said, was born at Ridgeland Farms in Dane County back in May 2022. When she was about 11 months old, she was shipped to a place called Red Beast Enterprises, which is a contract lab out in Fort Collins, Colorado. They experiment on dogs, cats, sometimes rats, but mostly beagles and cats. For big pharmaceutical groups, for veterinary drug companies, etc. And in the course of a PETA undercover investigator's time working at that facility, she asked again and again and again if she could adopt an animal, if she could help rescue an animal who otherwise was going to be put down or sent to another laboratory at the end of their use at that lab. And finally, the company president relented. Interestingly, in your lead up, you were talking about how beagles are known to be docile, and that's why they're used in experiments. Temple was let go precisely because she did put up a fight. In the company president's words, she was too, quote unquote, wiggly and jumpy to use in experiments. And so her fight actually got her liberated. And my wife flew out to Denver and picked her up, drove her back across to Virginia, where we live. We fostered her, and back in late April, we adopted her. So she is comfortably napping to my side right now and is living the life that she has always deserved, and frankly, every dog at Ridgeland and other places like it deserve.
Do you know anything about what she went through before she came to you? And have you seen any effects from that time?
Yeah, so interestingly enough, when we received her, I noticed that the dew claws on all four of her hands had been snipped or burned off. She has these pretty remarkable scars where those claws would be, and that was not done in Colorado. So my hunch is that was done in Wisconsin. When she got to the lab in Colorado, the facility's veterinarian, who was a part-time person, by the way, put gynecological forceps down her throat and used them to cut pieces of her vocal cords out. This is what's called debarking. I know it's been discussed in your reporting on the Ridgeland case. That's something that they do there as well.
I
She
will
like
point out that they have said they haven't done it there for years, and it's one of the things that's come up in testimony. They've said they haven't done it for at least 4 or 5 years, but we know they have done it in the past. There was testimony about it. What really struck me, though, is you have video. Your undercover investigator got video of one of these, and I've heard about devocalization, and a lot of people really cringe at that one. But seeing the forceps going down the dog's mouth deep into the throat is a powerful image. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, they were pulled from cages one by one soon after they arrived at the facility. So they'd be probably 6 months to 1 year old. They would be put on a table. A worker would get behind them, hold them, lift open their jaws, and then the vet would shove this metal contraption down their throats, probably 12 inches or so. Take the cuts out, take the tissue out, and then the dog would be simply just taken back to a cage or kennel and left there to quote unquote recover. What's I think particularly disturbing about this is that they were denied pain relief afterwards. And everyone we've consulted says this is inherently a painful procedure. This is something that leaves a dog feeling tremendous pain and distress and suffering for days on end afterwards. And yet this was just part of doing business there.
Is there is there a scientific reason for doing that? Is there some reason that would need to be done to make them better lab experiment animals?
No, this is purely for human convenience. I mean, this is solely to make their barking, quote unquote, less shrill, in the words of the people in Colorado. It's simply because, obviously, when you have 5 beagles, let alone 100, let alone 2,500 in a building, they're going to be loud when you stick them in cages for their entire lives. You don't play with them, you don't interact with them. They bark and they bark and they bark, and that's loud. And the lab staff didn't want to hear it. And so the practice in Colorado, anyway, was to quote unquote debark or devocalize them.
We certainly know the power of visuals working in television, right? That's the medium that we operate in. Actually acquiring that video and being able to share it with your supporters or use it to try to convince people of your side of things. Can you tell us about the investigation side of PETA? Because as Brian alluded to, I think a lot of people maybe have stereotypical views of what PETA does, some of the other things, but this almost sounds like a spy novel playing out in terms of infiltrating a place like this and coming away with evidence, visuals.
Yeah, we have a number of brave individuals who, they live on the road. They give up their life. They typically don't start families. They don't have companion animals themselves because they're constantly living in hotels and going from state to state. But they apply for employment at facilities just like anyone else would. They use their proper identity. They use their work history. They simply do not admit that they work for PETA at the same time. They get hired, and they're expected to be, and they are model employees at the lab or the slaughterhouse or the pet dealer where they might work. They do the work that's expected of them there. But meanwhile, if they see what we believe to be violations of law, then they start recording and photographing and documenting their observations, their conversations with staff, etc., for the purpose of later going to law enforcement, going to a regulatory agency like USDA, for instance, sharing with these agencies what they themselves are never going to walk in and see in their own inspections. And then, of course, yes, sharing it with the public in hopes that raising awareness leads to different decisions by consumers, pressure from citizens on lawmakers to make policy changes at NIH, for instance, and so forth.
We were talking about this yesterday, Dan, you and I, that to get in and to do this, you certainly have to walk this fine line between, we talked about, you can't go in and just lie about who you are. You've got to just hope they don't ask a lot of questions. And then they get in and they get this stuff that's really powerful video. Once you get that evidence, once you have that, what is your hope that will come of people seeing the video of the forceps going down a beagle's throat, of seeing Temple, who we see in the videos you've provided, first on that transport home, looks extremely nervous, shaky, very anxious about what's uncertain. And then later on, running happily down the hallway, having the time of her life. But what do you hope comes from that when people see it?
Just a recognition that these are individual animals. When we talk about 16,000 dogs, or when we talk about 2,500 at Ridgeland, or when we talk about millions of mice and rats who frankly go uncounted in most laboratories simply because they just don't matter to people, they're all individuals. Temple is a complicated animal. She's a great person. She's a great creature. She has unique emotions. She has unique behaviors. It's been a joy getting to know her for the past 4 or 5, I guess, months since we took her in. And yet every single animal of every other species who's in a laboratory, or for that matter, in a factory farm or traveling around the country with a circus, is like her. They have their own complex personality that deserves respect, that deserves protection under law. And oftentimes, I think we have found that people's eyes can understandably kind of glaze over when you throw big figures at them. But when you show them one victim and tell her story, suddenly it strikes them. And then if they extrapolate from that, think, well, there are millions more like her who are undergoing similar things, but won't get the opportunity she's getting. It's that much more empowering for them, I think. And also I think it hits policymakers as well.
Dan, I'm interested in what you're hearing from these labs that have been the target of PETA's undercover research, or any of these businesses that partner with those labs. Have you gotten any feedback from them on the video that you've shown and the evidence you've uncovered?
No, unfortunately, we really haven't. Silence has been the rule so far. The most prominent user of the lab that we investigated in Colorado is Colorado State University, which is just a few miles down the road. And they have faculty there who have been experimenting on animals at this contract lab for years. And they have just stayed silent. They refuse to acknowledge, even to Colorado lawmakers, their ties to this facility. They won't commit to reconsidering that tie, even after the USDA went in and, frankly, corroborated what our investigator found and cited that lab for violating 11 different federal animal welfare regulations. Still, no one seems to be moved by that in this industry, which I think is really telling. I mean, you would expect at the very least that when presented with evidence like this, someone who has a real interest in animal welfare, or even their own bottom line in advancing human health, would say, no, we're not gonna keep doing business there. And yet, as far as we can tell, it's green light forward for everyone there still.
I think you heard part of our discussion in that first segment about the other side of this question, which is what is lost if we are not able to do some of the scientific research for the betterment of human health in many cases. What would be your response in terms of what you would like to see in terms of the way science is researched and experimented in America? is there an avenue for any animal testing in your world, or what is the cost benefit analysis from your side of things?
There's not any room for testing on a single animal in our view. When we were founded in 1980, and one of the most, I think, attributed quotes to our organization from the early days was essentially that, even if there was a cure for AIDS found and it came at the expense of one rodent's life, in PETA's view, it wouldn't be worth it. My dad, just personally speaking, my dad has Parkinson's disease, and obviously I want him to beat that. I don't want him to suffer and to go downhill from that. It appalls me that money is being spent somehow to help someone like him by afflicting rodents with something like that disease. I would much rather see that money go into the technologically advanced means that we have available now that you were speaking about earlier. At the end of the day, it's for PETA anyway, it's about individual animals, and they do not get a chance to consent to being experimented on. No one should be treated as a guinea pig. Guinea pigs shouldn't be treated as guinea pigs. Human beings shouldn't be treated as guinea pigs, clearly. If we're going to do research on other individuals, they should get the chance to agree to it. And non-human animals just simply can't do that.
The last question I want to ask you on this is along those lines, though. You are sitting there with a dog that you've adopted. You have Temple next to you. You don't have a rat that was rescued from a lab that's in you. There is something about domestic animals. And I think from our viewers, we see their response to dogs being experimented on. They may not feel the same way you or your organization does about a mouse or a rat or something else. Is there an issue there? Is there, like, when we talk about this sort of slippery slope or this spectrum, is there a place where the public is like, they'll be on board with not doing it on dogs and cats, but maybe want to still do it with rats because, after all, Parkinson's is a big deal?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to be fair, we have rescued rats and mice and chinchillas and other animals of various species from labs and placed them in homes. And I do think that those individual stories also strike people at their heart. It is a slippery slope. I think that it's wise to highlight the plight of dogs and cats precisely because these are the species most of us are familiar with and share our homes with. And a lot of people can look at someone like Temple and someone like a dog in their own home and say, well, I would never put my dog in a cage for that to be done, and no other dog should be subjected to the same. It is easier for people to, I think, come to grips with it being done to species they're maybe afraid of, they don't understand as well, they maybe see as pests and so forth. But ultimately, there is no difference between Temple and a rat and a mouse and a pig in a laboratory because they're all mammals. They all feel pain and suffer and feel terror and fear very similar. And they're being used in these labs precisely because in some ways they're very similar to us as a species. And it's only convenience for an experimenter to say that the similarities end when it comes to their emotional state or their capability to feel pain.
Well, Dan Payton with he's Vice President of Investigations for PETA. I really appreciate you spending this time with us here on Open Record. Thanks a lot for your time.
Thank you so much for doing what you do.
And one thing I want to point out is that there are certainly other sides to this whole thing. We did invite the University of Wisconsin, which does a lot of animal research, to come on the podcast. They did not respond. We invited the National Association of Biomedical Research, which has written direct responses to the NIH's comments about dogs and cats. They did not respond. And I invited Ridgeland Farms to come on the podcast. They also did not respond. But we're going to talk about some of the latest updates on the many investigations that are still going on at Ridgeland Farms. And we'll do that when we come right back after this. Welcome back to Open Record. I want to talk about some of the stuff that's going on with Ridgeland Farms, but I know, Carl, you've got some thoughts.
A fascinating conversation with Dan there. Obviously, he is from one side of this argument, and when you see a picture of an animal like that, like Temple, it's hard to argue with that. But I found it fascinating, him putting his own personal story up there, and I think basically saying, like, if there was a cure for his father's Parkinson's, but it required experimentation on animals, he would not want that cure. And I don't know if that's the same answer that many people in America, in Wisconsin, would have. I'm curious about the other options, right? If there is another option for medical research and for some of these breakthroughs that does not involve harming animals, of course, everyone would go for that. You've looked into some of that, Brian, and it's a bit of a question of what's possible in lab testing versus what still in some ways requires animal testing.
We did a whole story looking at a place called STEM Farm in Madison, the startup, tech startup, and they are doing neural organoids, looking specifically at Alzheimer's disease. And even they said, while we think this technology is great and is going to be much, much better than research on animals, it's not ready yet to completely eliminate the use of animals. In fact, right now they say we need to kind of compare what we can do to what you can do with an animal so we can see where the weaknesses might be or the strengths. So validation has to happen. But I think this really illustrates the point you're making, which is if you look at research polls, there's an organization called the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine. Now, they're biased. They don't like animal testing, but they did a survey that found 85% of Americans say government funding should prioritize non-animal research methods. That's different from saying if the only way to do it was to use a mouse, you shouldn't do it.
Right.
Because if you actually ask people, do you support, cures for this, that, I mean, it's how you word a question matters, right?
Right.
According to Pew Research, 52% of Americans oppose animal testing in general. That's much less than 85%, but it's a slight majority. But then if you get to things like you've got this guy from PETA, you look at the number of people who are vegans or vegetarians who say we shouldn't even be eating animals, much less testing on them. Vegans are 1% of the population, according to Gallup polls, and vegetarians 4%. So how you ask the question, where you draw the line, can give you a dramatic different result. But I think the thing right now people look at is go, if there are alternatives, we should be moving toward them.
Sure. And
And that's what we're hearing FDA and NIH say for the first time publicly is we are starting to phase that out. We want to move toward these new methods.
Right. And while the video is hard to see, to Carl's point, if it's your child or something, I think a lot of people would say, I'd do whatever it takes to find a cure and to research. So it becomes difficult when it involves someone close to you or a disease that hits you personally, where we all benefit from the research that's done on animals in these cases.
I think that's one of the reasons why so much of this has happened out of sight. Maybe sometimes we didn't want to look.
Right.
But when you look inside of Ridgeland Farms or you look inside this laboratory in Colorado and you see the forceps going down the dog's throat and cutting their vocal cords, you go, well, wait a minute. I
this
certainly
makes
want
me uncomfortable.
cures, but I'm uncomfortable with this. So what do we do about it? And certainly if you can do it without using animals, I think everyone agrees that would be the better way to
Yeah,
go.
and that specifically that forceps is important to note too, that he said that was not a necessary part of the
Right.
scientific experiment as well. That was separate from that. But,
Absolutely.
it's like
No,
a moral quandary here.
There's a lot. Now, and I've got a lot listed here. We were not going to go to all of it.
Yeah.
One of the things I wanted to point out, though, is that Ridgeland Farms is engaged in a legal business. What they do, the government actually for many years said, we want you to breed beagles because we need them for research. So what they're doing is legal. That said, there are limits under the law as to how you can treat animals. And some of the allegations that are being, that are the subject of these investigations, there's a criminal investigation, there's disciplinary investigations, have to do with whether or not they've lived up to those animal cruelty laws. And some people will say that those laws aren't strict enough as they are, but they exist in whatever state they're in. The question of whether they should have been delegating some of these painful procedures to people who are not licensed veterinarians is a question that's still out there. Whether or not some of the conditions at Ridgeland Farms, if the animals were getting enough human contact or attention on a daily basis as required, if the drainage systems were good enough, if the stalls were clean, things like that. That's all stuff that falls within the legal process, but are you living up to animal welfare?
Right.
There are certainly people here that don't really care whether they're living up to animal welfare or not. They just don't want them to do it. And obviously there's a lot left to be learned about all of this.
It seems like kind of a watershed moment. I know you had that as a possible topic with Dan as well, but I know you've been doing this series of stories more recently. The video that's featured comes from years ago, but it seems like so much is happening right now. Do you get that sense as well? Not just because you've been covering this so closely?
Yeah, no, that's one of the reasons I think I'm still on it is because once I started looking at this, I realized things are happening. There are these new technologies that are emerging, so we wanted to learn more about what those are. And you see the federal government making moves to get away from something that's been the norm for generations now. So we do see we're at a critical point in time where things are changing. For some, they may not be changing fast enough, but it looks like it's moving toward ultimately eliminating animal testing one day. Will we ever get there, or how long will it take? I think that's what remains to be seen, but this is a very interesting time in the world of animal research.
Right. Is there anything else you want to tell us before we move on?
No, I think that's probably it for this. I think we can, I'll say this much. We're going to be talking about it, I think, for a while to come yet. I don't think this is the end of the story, but we will take a break and go off the record, and you'll find out why my voice sounds like this when we come back right after this. And it is time for us to go off the record. This is the part of the podcast where we get a little more casual and have a little fun by answering a question for which none of us is prepared because Sarah's not here, but
Okay.
she gave you a question in this sheet of paper. But before we get to that, my voice seems to have done okay.
It held
But
up this podcast.
Honestly, I don't know if people would have necessarily noticed if you hadn't drawn attention to it.
Maybe it's just because I feel it. And I was afraid I was going to be struggling. Now I'm just struggling to get through because I ran downstairs to get this question and I ran up steps. But anyway, I was at Cedar Point Amusement Park in Sandusky, Ohio over the weekend.
Okay.
And they've got some pretty great roller
sure
coasters
do.
there. And one of them is called Steel Vengeance. And you can't take your phone on these rides. So I had to lock it away in a locker, but I still have my Apple Watch on. And I was like, I can record audio. This might be fun.
Okay.
So I recorded audio of the ride and then paired it with their promotional point
funny.
of view
Love it.
video. And this is why my voice sounds the way it does today.
Is that a wooden coaster?
So it's a wood structure, but it's a steel, like new technology coaster. So it's really smooth.
Nice.
And because of that technology, it can do things that you normally couldn't do on a wooden coaster, which you're about to see. And
You're
my
climbing
audio-
pretty high right now.
Yeah.
Okay.
But my audio recording kicks in here in just a few seconds. This is like their stock
Are you a
recording. But
coaster guy?
I love roller coasters. One of my favorite things to do, and my kids love them too. So here we go.
Okay, let's go.
Right, getting to the top. Oh no.
Embarrassing to hear myself. Oh, I was having a great time. My favorite part's coming up here in a second.
Only halfway. That's not even.
That's probably it. You get the point.
So how many of these did you go on? Like,
Well, so I went on that one 3 times in 2 days, once at night, which was
So
phenomenal.
awesome.
Overall, I think we got in about 20 roller coaster rides because the first day we bought one of those fast passes where you can
Yeah,
like jump the line
hit 'em all.
and you just stare at the other people in line going, ha ha, until the next day when I didn't have one and then I was sad.
This is a long roller coaster.
It is a very, very long roller coaster. And so this last part at the end, you feel like you're bucking a bronco.
Yeah.
You're up and down, and it never stops. And they're finally got to
And
the
your
end.
stomach can handle 20 of these?
Oh, well, it was exhausting. It actually,
physically?
it was hot out, and then I was getting tired from the screaming and then from the just adrenaline rush. But I love that kind of stuff. It was a lot of fun. Anyway,
We should have done this as like a wrong answers only.
Yeah,
Why does
yeah.
Brian not have a voice? And then that would have been such a great reveal.
No, I
I did not guess
I was
roller
wondering- I might
coaster.
have to say, I don't know if we have time for that one because now we're almost running out of time.
Yeah,
But
save
are
it.
you guys roller coaster people?
So this is really funny because I am the like designated Fox 6 Wake Up roller coaster
Yeah,
person.
you did.
when there's
You
a
did
new
it
ride, you
recently.
go on.
But only because no one else will do it. So
Right.
I myself am not a crazy roller coaster person. Like we didn't go to a bunch of theme parks growing up, but whenever Six Flags Great America opens up a new ride,
Sure, yeah,
I
okay.
am the well, to use a terrible term for this segment, the guinea pig who gets sent down.
Way to bring it all
to
around.
Gurnee.
Way to bring it
Yikes.
around, Carl.
Yikes. Okay. So I seek them out, but I'll do it a couple times in the morning for live TV because, as you just heard, watching, seeing, hearing people on roller coasters is always entertaining. I do it like 2 or 3 times and I'm good. I'm
Right.
toast. So you can do it all day like this.
We had the fast pass. I didn't want to waste the money, so I went from 9 a.m. until 11 p.m.
Wow, that's a long
And then
day.
the next day, I'm still feeling it today. I still feel totally out of it. But
See, I'm on the other end of this. My family went to Bay Beach Amusement Park in May for the first time, which is so great. I love how affordable and fun it is for kids. I went on the swings ride thinking that would be simple and easy, right? You're just going in a circle, a gentle swing around. I got off it and felt sick to my stomach. And then I was glad that I'd started there and didn't start with like a roller coaster or something. So I'd be the one that would force you to step up,
fair.
Carl,
I can
if I
do
worked
the
with you.
coasters, but spinny rides they make
That's
me
true.
dizzy. I
Like the teacups at
oh,
Disney.
no
I
way.
mean, I get
No
sick in
way.
cars.
Yeah.
So give me the wrong photographer and I'll just be moaning.
But I could have done that 20 times if I had been able to get in line that many times. I just love the roller coasters.
Oh my God, the back is fast!
Well, that's all our time for today. We'll wrap things up when we come right back. That is all the time we have for today. If you have a topic you'd like us to discuss on Open Record or an issue you think we should investigate for Fox 6 News, send us an email to fox6investigators@fox.com. Jenna, Carl, thank you very much.
A pleasure.
Dave Machuda behind the scenes, our chief photographer, Cale Zimney. With that, I'm Bryan Polcyn. We'll be back next week.